Hello, welcome to Bible Questions with Christopher. This video focuses on understanding God's will. Specifically, I'm going to try to answer the question, what is God's will for our lives, by looking at 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. My guess is you want to know God's will because you are facing some major life decision. Something like what career you should choose, where you should live, whether you should live in Chicago or New York, who you should date, whether you should get married, or whether you should have kids. To simplify, you want to know whether you should choose option A or option B. I know that's true for me. I have often wondered what God's will is when faced with major life decisions. I have good news and bad news. Let's start with the good news. The good news is that the Bible tells us exactly what God's will is for our lives. One of the places it does that is in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. Let's take a look at what that passage says. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. For this is the will of God, your sanctification. Now, this passage could not be any clearer. God's will is our sanctification. Now, sanctification is not a word we use too often these days, but effectively it is the process by which we become holy, the process by which we become more obedient to God and live lives that please God. Now for the bad news. I've definitely looked at this passage and thought, well, it's great that God's will is my sanctification, but that doesn't help me with the problem I'm facing. My guess is some of you are thinking the same thing. This passage doesn't help you decide who to date, what job to take, or where to live. But the bad news is not that this passage doesn't help us make the decision. The bad news is it reveals we want to know God's will for the wrong reason. Why do we really want God's help with big decisions? I suspect it's that we believe if we make the right decision, our lives will turn out great. We want our life to turn out great, and we want God's help. The bad news is that this mindset reveals our goals are different than God's. God's will has nothing to do with our lives turning out great. Our focus is on us, not God. But 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3 tells us that God's will is that we live lives that are holy, lives that are obedient, lives that please God. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3 tells us it's not really about deciding between A and B. It's really about why do we want to understand God's will in the first place? Why do we want to know God's will? So what is your motivation for knowing God's will? If it's so that your life turns out great, that's the wrong reason. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3 tells us that God's will is our sanctification, which we've defined as living a life that is obedient to God, living a life that pleases God, and that should be why we want to know God's will. Here's my recommendation. Ask yourself, why do you want to know God's will? If you're like me, you need to change your focus. My life needs to be all about pleasing God and obeying Him, not making my life turn out great. So what do? How do we change? This is really a condition of the heart. So I recommend two things. First, we acknowledge that our motivation is misplaced and our focus needs to be on pleasing God, not having lives that turn out great. Second, caring about pleasing God is easier said than done. So I recommend that we pray for help from God to give us the right motivation for understanding His will. Again, not so that our lives turn out great, so that we would please Him instead. My name is Christopher, and I hope this video has been helpful in understanding more about God's will and in answering the question, what is God's will for our lives, by looking at 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. So what did you think? Let me know in the comments below.